Part 1: The video. I first saw the Half-Light game the way most people my age discover almost everything now, a short clip, no context, forwarded into a group chat by someone who captioned it only with 3 question marks, as though even they weren't entirely sure what they were sending. The clip itself was 11 seconds long, shot in what looked like an ordinary suburban hallway at dusk, every light in the house visibly off, the camera holders breathing audible and ragged, and at the very end, just before the clip cut to black, a second shape appeared in the hallway behind the person holding the phone, tall, still, positioned in a doorway that, according to every subsequent frame-by-frame breakdown obsessive corners of the internet produced over the following weeks, had been empty a full 2 seconds earlier. My name is Odalise, and I want to be upfront that I am not, by nature, a credulous person. I worked, at the time all of this started, as a copy editor for a regional news outlet, a job that had trained me, if anything, toward reflexive skepticism about viral content. I'd spent 3 years fact-checking claims for a living, and I approached that 11-second clip the same way I approached everything else that crossed my feed. Assuming first that it was fabricated and looking for the seam. I want to describe what that search for a seam actually looked like, because I think the specific rigor of it matters for understanding why I eventually stopped being able to dismiss the whole phenomenon as easily as I'd expected to. I ran the clip through 3 separate deepfake and manipulation detection tools our newsroom kept licensed access to, all 3 returning results within normal ranges for an unedited recording. I traced the account that had originally posted it back through several reposts to what appeared to be a genuine, if newly created, personal account, no history of prior viral content, no pattern suggesting a deliberate hoax built for engagement farming. I even reached out, cautiously, through a direct message the account never answered, in case there was a mundane explanation waiting on the other side of a simple question I hadn't thought to ask yet. I didn't find one, not in that first clip, and not in the dozens more that surfaced over the following month as the Half-Light game spread from a handful of anonymous forum posts into something closer to a genuine, self-sustaining phenomenon. The rules, as best anyone could piece them together from scattered, inconsistent accounts, were deceptively simple. You waited for the specific 20-minute window local meteorological data called civil twilight, the half-light between full daylight and true dark, different every day, different by location, calculated to the minute, and during that window alone in a house with every light switched off, you were to walk its length from front door to back in a straight line without deviation, without turning around, no matter what you heard behind you. If you completed the walk before the window closed, you were rewarded, according to the game's scattered mythology, with what its practitioners called clean sight, the ability, for exactly 1 week afterward, to perceive something the game's community described only in oblique, contradictory fragments, most of which amounted to some version of finally seeing what had supposedly always been standing just outside the edge of ordinary attention. If you turned around before reaching the back door, or if the window closed before you finished the walk, the game's rules were considerably less clear about what happened next. And it was that specific deliberate vagueness, every account hedging, every survivor's testimonial trailing off into ellipses right at the point where actual consequence should have been described, that first made me suspicious this wasn't simply an elaborate creepypasta dressed up as an alternate reality game. Fabricated horror, in my experience fact-checking hundreds of viral claims, tends to over-explain itself, eager to deliver a satisfying payoff. This felt different. It felt like something being carefully, deliberately underexplained by people who either didn't fully understand what they were describing, or understood it well enough to know that saying more wouldn't help anyone. My younger brother Teodoro was the reason I ended up looking into it as closely as I did. He was 22, 3 years out of a computer science degree he'd never quite found steady work in, spending most of his time in online spaces I only half understood, and he mentioned the Half-Light game to me over dinner one night with the specific, guarded excitement of someone testing whether a topic was safe to bring up around family. He and 4 friends from an online gaming community, people he'd known for years but, as far as I knew, had never actually met in person, were planning to attempt it together the following week, coordinating over video call, each of them in their own separate house, walking their own separate hallway during the same shared twilight window. I told him it sounded like an obvious hoax designed to farm engagement, and he nodded along in the specific way people do when they've already decided to do something and are simply waiting for the conversation to end so they can go do it anyway. Part 2. What happened to Marisol? I want to introduce the 4 friends properly because I think what happened to each of them matters too much to reduce to a body count, and because I've spent the last several months getting to know all of them considerably better than I ever expected to, under circumstances none of us wanted. Marisol Andrade was the one who'd actually found the original forum post and brought it to the group, a graphic designer sharp and skeptical by nature much like myself, who'd approached the whole thing initially as a joke, a shared dare to see who'd actually go through with something so obviously absurd. She was, by every account from those who knew her, the last person any of them would have expected to take the game seriously enough to risk anything real over it, which is part of why her fate has haunted the rest of the group as thoroughly as it has. If the skeptic among them hadn't been safe, none of them could quite convince themselves they were either. Benedek Farkas, who everyone called Benny, was the group's resident true believer, the one who'd spent considerable time in deeper corners of the game's associated forums, collecting and cross-referencing survivor accounts with a seriousness the rest of the group mostly found endearing rather than concerning. Priscilla Njoku ran a small home business restoring vintage furniture, and had joined the friend group later than the others, eager, Teodoro told me, to prove herself as fully part of it. And Griffin Okafor, no relation to any Okafor I'd heard of before, a common enough name, was, by every account I've since gathered, the quietest of the five, along mostly because the others were doing it and he didn't want to be the one who backed out. They coordinated the attempt for a Thursday evening, civil twilight calculated at slightly different minutes across their 5 separate locations spread over 2 states, video call open on a shared screen the entire time so each of them could, at minimum, hear if something went wrong for one of the others, even if the actual walk itself had to be undertaken alone, in an unlit house. Phone left recording in a fixed position near each front door to document the attempt. I have watched the footage from that Thursday more times than is probably healthy because Teodoro in the aftermath gave me copies of everything the group recorded, unable I think to bear reviewing it alone but equally unable to simply delete it and pretend the evening away. Marisol's footage is the one I return to most, because Marisol was the group's skeptic, the one who approached the whole exercise with the same reflexive doubt I'd have brought myself. And watching her particular attempt unfold is watching someone's careful, rational composure erode in real time against something her own doubt couldn't hold back. Her hallway on camera is a fairly ordinary stretch of a modest apartment, front door, a narrow run of maybe 20 feet, a back door leading out to a small enclosed porch. She began the walk exactly on the window's opening minute, moving at a slow, deliberate pace, and for the first several seconds, nothing on the recording suggests anything unusual at all. Then, at roughly the 8-second mark, her breathing changes on the audio, quickens, catches, and though she does not turn around, the recording captures something crossing behind her at the very edge of the frame, low to the ground, moving considerably faster than anything crossing a normal domestic hallway should move, gone from view again before it's fully resolved into anything describable. She reached the back door with what the timestamp confirms was 11 seconds to spare before the window closed, and on the group call, her voice when she finally spoke was shaking in a way none of the others had heard from her before. "I don't know what that was," she said. "I don't want to know what that was. I made it. I'm done. I'm never doing this again." The others told me separately in the weeks that followed that Marisol had seemed genuinely fine for the remainder of that call, relieved, even laughing a little at herself for how badly the whole thing had rattled her, the specific familiar relief of someone who believes the worst has already passed. Benny said she'd made plans before they all signed off to get coffee with him the following weekend, plans that were, by every account, entirely ordinary, entirely forward-looking, nothing that suggested a person bracing for anything further. None of them ever got the chance to ask her more about it, or to keep those plans. Marisol Andrade did not answer her phone the following morning, did not show up to her design studio for a scheduled client meeting, and when her building superintendent finally let a welfare check officer into her apartment 2 days later, she was gone. Not dead, not visibly harmed, simply gone, every possession undisturbed, front door locked from the inside, no sign of forced entry, no trace of her whereabouts that any subsequent investigation has ever been able to establish. Her coffee cup, according to the officer's report, was still sitting in the drying rack beside her sink, washed and put away the night before, the small mundane evidence of a woman who had gone to bed expecting an entirely ordinary tomorrow. Part 3: What the Others Saw. I want to walk through what happened to the remaining 3 that same night because I think the specific differences between each of their experiences matter for understanding what the Half-Light game actually is, or at least what I've come to believe it actually is after months of trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to make sense of it. Benny's attempt, by his own account, was the one that came closest in the moment to feeling almost peaceful, a claim that unsettled me more than any description of overt terror could have, hearing it from Teodoro secondhand in the days afterward. He described reaching his own back door with what felt, subjectively, like an easy margin, and described the presence he'd sensed behind him throughout the walk not as threatening but as patient, curious, almost gentle, the way you might feel a cat watching you from across a room rather than anything actively predatory. He completed the walk within the window, technically successful by the game's own stated rules, and for the following week, he told the group, he genuinely believed he'd been granted whatever clean sight was actually supposed to mean. A persistent, low-grade sense, he said, of seeing things at the edge of his vision that resolved into nothing when he turned to look at them directly, not frightening exactly, more like finally being aware of a room's specific proportions after years of only half noticing them. Benny is still alive. I want that stated plainly and early, because I think it matters that not everyone who attempted the half-light game paid the same price, and that the price itself seems to have had less to do with whether you technically succeeded by the game's own rules and more to do with something considerably harder to predict or control. But Benny has not been, by any account from anyone who knew him before that Thursday, fully himself since. He describes, when he's willing to describe it at all, a persistent difficulty distinguishing, in the days immediately following any subsequent twilight window, whether the people around him are entirely who they present themselves to be. A low background unease that flares specifically and reliably every single evening during that same 20-minute civil twilight period, regardless of the season, regardless of where he happens to be. Priscilla's attempt did not go nearly as smoothly. Her footage shows her reaching almost the exact midpoint of her hallway before stopping entirely, frozen, for nearly 4 full seconds, an eternity watching it, for seconds of complete stillness in a game whose entire premise depends on continuous forward motion, before continuing, visibly shaken, audio picking up a whispered fragment of speech too quiet and too distorted for anyone to definitively transcribe, though Benny, listening to it obsessively in the weeks afterward, became convinced. It was saying her own name slightly mispronounced, in a cadence that matched, unsettlingly, her own grandmother's voice, dead for over a decade. I spoke with Priscilla myself several weeks after that Thursday, and she described the 4 seconds of stillness in a way that didn't fully match what the footage alone suggested. She said it hadn't felt from the inside like fear freezing her in place, but something closer to genuinely believing, for those 4 seconds, that continuing forward was somehow the wrong choice. A certainty, arriving from nowhere she could identify, that turning around and going back toward the sound calling her name was actually the safer, more natural option, and that some separate, more stubborn part of her had simply refused to act on that certainty long enough for it to pass. She reached her back door within the window, technically successful, and has, in the months since, developed a specific, persistent difficulty with mirrors, not full avoidance, nothing dramatic or immediately visible to anyone who doesn't know her well, but a small, consistent hesitation before meeting her own reflection directly, and an insistence, when pressed gently by those closest to her, that the reflection sometimes moves a fraction of a second before she does, rather than in the perfect synchrony a mirror should maintain. Griffin's attempt was the only one of the 4 that failed outright by the game's own stated terms. He turned around. Part 4. Griffin's account. I met Griffin in person 3 weeks after that Thursday, at a coffee shop near his apartment that he'd insisted on choosing himself, somewhere well-lit, crowded, the kind of place, I understood without him needing to say so, that felt safe specifically because of how thoroughly unlike a quiet, unlit hallway it was. He was the quietest of the group, Teodoro had told me, and that quality had only deepened since that Thursday, a withdrawal so pronounced that Teodoro had started genuinely worrying about him well beyond simple concern for a badly shaken friend. I don't remember deciding to turn around, Griffin told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us rather than looking directly at me for most of our conversation. That's the part one can't get past. Every account I've read about people who failed the walk describes some specific moment of panic, some sound or sensation that made them break and look back. I didn't have that. I remember walking forward normally maybe 6 or 7 steps in, and then I remember standing at my own front door again, facing the wrong direction with absolutely no memory of the seconds in between. Like something just edited them out. He described, over the following hour, a series of changes in his life since that Thursday that he was clearly reluctant to fully catalog even to himself, let alone to a near stranger with a recorder, but that emerged gradually as our conversation continued. He'd started losing small stretches of time, not dramatically, not entire missing days, but minutes here and there, most often, he said, during that same 20-minute civil twilight window, regardless of where he happened to be or what he'd been doing immediately before. He'd started finding small objects in his apartment rearranged in ways he had no memory of doing himself. A chair turned to face a different direction, a cupboard door left open that he was certain he'd closed. And he'd started, in the last 2 weeks specifically, hearing faintly, during that same twilight window, a voice he was becoming less and less able to convince himself wasn't his own, coming from somewhere behind whatever room he was currently standing in, speaking too quietly for him to make out words, but present reliably every single evening. He also told me, hesitantly, about a change in how his own reflection had started behaving, a detail he hadn't mentioned to any of the others in the group yet, worried, he admitted, that saying it aloud would make it feel more permanently true than he was ready for it to be. He described catching his reflection more than once now, holding an expression his own face hadn't consciously formed, a small private smile, a narrowing of the eyes, gone by the time he blinked and looked again, but present long enough each time, that he'd started avoiding mirrors in any room he intended to spend real time in, keeping his bathroom mirror covered with a towel more nights than not. "I think something followed me back," he said, finally, meeting my eyes directly for what might have been the first time in our entire conversation. "I know how that sounds. I've read enough of the forum accounts by now to know it's exactly the kind of thing everyone who's attempted this ends up saying eventually, which almost makes it worse, somehow like there's a script and I'm just falling into my assigned part of it instead of experiencing something that's actually specifically happening to me. But I don't know how else to describe what I've been losing. A few minutes at a time, every single evening since that Thursday." I asked him whether he'd considered attempting the walk again, successfully this time on the theory, one that recurred, I'd noticed, across several of the more credible-seeming forum accounts, that a completed walk might somehow close whatever had been left open by a failed one. He went very still, holding his coffee cup without drinking from it, and told me quietly that he'd thought about almost nothing else for 3 weeks, and that he was more afraid of what completing the walk might actually cost him than he was of whatever continuing to lose small stretches of time every evening for the rest of his life might eventually add up to. Part 5. My own research. I want to be honest about why I kept investigating this well past the point any reasonable journalist would have called the story finished. Marisol's disappearance had been reported briefly in local news coverage that treated it as an ordinary missing persons case. No mention anywhere of the half-light game or the circumstances immediately preceding her vanishing, because none of the surviving 4 had been willing to volunteer that detail to investigators who would, they all correctly predicted, treat it as either an irrelevant distraction or grounds for psychiatric evaluation rather than genuine investigative leads. I understood their reluctance. I shared it, honestly, for longer than I'm proud of, telling myself that pursuing this further was simply professional curiosity rather than something closer to the same compulsion that had driven Tobias. In an entirely different account I've heard secondhand from a friend who runs a horror channel, to keep running a signal through his equipment on a continuous loop long after every instinct should have told him to stop. I sat with Marisol's case file for a long time before deciding to go further than any responsible fact-checker should have. I remember the specific moment that tipped the decision, reading the responding officer's note that her possessions were undisturbed, and understanding, with a clarity that unsettled me more than any dramatic detail could have, that the word undisturbed was doing an enormous amount of quiet, unexamined work in that report, papering over a disappearance that had left absolutely no trace of struggle, no trace of an intruder, no trace of anything except a woman's ordinary evening followed by her complete and total absence the following morning. I spent the following 2 months tracing the Half-Light game's origins as far back as I could manage, using every fact-checking skill 3 years of professional practice had given me. What I found complicated, rather than resolved, my initial assumption that this was simply an elaborate piece of collaborative online fiction that had gotten dangerously out of hand. The earliest identifiable references to something resembling the game's specific rules, the twilight window, the unlit hallway, the prohibition against turning around, predated the internet entirely, appearing in scattered folklore collections from several distinct, geographically unrelated regions, always described in slightly different local language, but with a structural core so consistent across sources that separated by both distance and centuries that simple cultural transmission seemed, to me, like an inadequate explanation. One source in particular, a regional folklore archive I accessed through a university library database, described a 19th-century rural practice referred to in translation as walking the threshold hour, a ritual, according to the archive's brief annotation, that local communities had actively discouraged and eventually suppressed, associated with several documented disappearances across a roughly 30-year period before the practice, as far as the historical record showed, simply stopped being attempted at all. The annotation offered no explanation for why the practice resurfaced now, in this specific internet native form, though I've come to suspect, without any way to actually confirm it, that it never really stopped being attempted somewhere, in some form, and that the internet has simply made a previously scattered, geographically isolated practice suddenly, catastrophically visible and shareable at a scale it was never designed to reach. I found, cross-referencing dozens of forum accounts against local missing persons databases in the areas where those accounts originated, a disturbing pattern of unexplained disappearances clustering around dates that matched, with unsettling consistency, attempted or reported completions of the game in those same local areas. I want to be careful about how I characterize this pattern because I am not a statistician, and I recognize the very real risk of finding a pattern because I was already looking for one. But the correlation was strong enough across a large enough sample that I eventually stopped being able to dismiss it as simple coincidence, and started instead genuinely fearing what continuing to dig might eventually cost me. I want to describe one particular thread of that research that I've never told anyone else about, not even Teodoro, because I've never fully worked out how to hold it steady in my own mind long enough to explain it clearly. In cross-referencing the Folklore Archive's 19th century threshold hour, accounts against the modern forum's scattered testimonials, I found language in both describing the same specific detail, a claim, repeated independently across sources separated by well over a century and considerable geographic distance, that whatever answers the walk does not experience time in the same continuous, linear way its human counterpart does. Several older accounts described community members who successfully completed the ritual reporting, afterward, a persistent sense that the other side of the threshold had been rehearsing their movements for far longer than the walker had actually been performing them, an unsettling asymmetry that several modern forum accounts described in almost identical language, down to the specific word rehearsing, despite, as far as I could determine, having no access to or awareness of the older folklore sources at all. I don't know what to do with that detail except report it here, exactly as I found it, because I think it matters for understanding the specific patient quality every survivor account eventually describes, not aggression, not overt malice, but something closer to a vast, unhurried practice session finally nearing whatever it's been building toward. Part 6, Teodoro. I need to tell you what happened to my brother because I've been circling it, and I think I've been circling it because it's the hardest part of this account to actually write down plainly. Teodoro did not attempt the half-light game himself that Thursday. He'd been the one coordinating the group call, watching each of his friends' footage in real time rather than attempting his own walk, and in the immediate aftermath all of us, myself included, treated that fact as a genuine mercy, a reason to be grateful that whatever had happened to Marisol and touched the other three in smaller, stranger ways had at least spared him directly. I don't believe that anymore. Over the following months, as I pursued my research and Griffin pursued his own increasingly desperate attempts to understand what was happening to him, Teodoro grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending increasing stretches of time alone in his apartment during exactly the same 20-minute twilight window that had governed everything else in this account, a pattern I only noticed because I'd started, by that point, tracking that window's shifting daily time as obsessively as any of the game's actual participants. When I finally asked him directly, sitting across from him at the same dinner table where he'd first mentioned the game to me months earlier, whether something was happening to him too, he was quiet for a long time before answering. I watched all of it happen through a screen, he said. I told myself that made me separate from it, an observer rather than a participant. I don't think that's actually true anymore. I think watching closely enough for long enough at exactly the right moment might be its own kind of walking the hallway, just slower, just harder to notice happening to you until it's already most of the way finished. He described hesitantly the same small losses of time Griffin had described to me, though considerably milder, considerably less frequent. A minute here, less than that most evenings, barely noticeable except that he had, by that point, started keeping his own private log, much like Edmund Farrow in an entirely different account, tracking each instance with a careful, escalating attentiveness that frightened me more than the actual missing minutes themselves because I recognized, watching my own brother do it, The exact same compulsive, doomed vigilance I'd already watched consume every other person this story has touched. I asked to see the log. He hesitated for a long time before finally handing me his phone, and I want to describe what I found there, because I think it's the detail that finally fully convinced me this was not simply a family of anxious people feeding each other's anxiety in an echo chamber. His entries were dated, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the exact civil twilight window for our specific location each day, and beginning roughly 3 weeks in, a new column had appeared that he hadn't mentioned to me at all, a tally climbing steadily night over night, that he'd labeled in a small careful hand I recognized instantly because it was so unmistakably an echo of my own handwriting, simply count. I did not need to ask him what he was counting. I understood, looking at those climbing numbers, that whatever governed Edmund Farrow's lighthouse and whatever governed my own brother's quiet apartment evenings were, whatever their surface differences, drawing from the exact same well. I asked him to stop watching the footage, to delete every copy he still had, to simply try to let the whole thing recede into an ordinary bad memory rather than something he continued, nightly, to feed with his attention. He told me he'd tried. He told me that trying didn't seem to matter as much as I wanted it to, that whatever had actually been set in motion that Thursday evening did not appear, from where he was standing, to require his continued cooperation to keep slowly, patiently unfolding. Part 7. What I believe now. I don't have a clean resolution to offer you, and I've decided, writing this final section, that manufacturing one would dishonor everything the 5 of them actually lived through, 4 of whom are still, in various diminished and frightened ways, living through it right now as I write this. Marisol has not been found. I don't expect her to be. Benny continues managing his low-grade unease about the people around him with what I can only describe as remarkable quiet courage, refusing to let it fully close him off from the life he's still trying to live. Priscilla still hesitates before mirrors. Griffin has not attempted the walk again, and I don't know whether that caution is protecting him or simply prolonging something that was always going to reach its conclusion regardless of what he does or doesn't do about it. And my brother keeps his private log evening after evening, and I have stopped asking him to stop because I think, watching everyone this story has touched, that the compulsion to keep watching, keep tracking, keep trying to understand something that was never designed to be fully understood by the people it touches, might simply be the actual shape this particular horror takes once it's found its way into you. I believe, after months of research I increasingly regret undertaking, that the half-light game is not new, and that the internet did not create it so much as rediscover and radically amplify something that has apparently always been quietly, patiently available to anyone willing to walk an unlit hallway during those specific 20 minutes when the world is neither fully day nor fully night. I believe whatever answers that invitation does not care very much whether the walker succeeds or fails by the game's own stated rules, because I have watched people from both categories pay a price in the months since, in different currencies at different speeds, but a price regardless. I have not attempted the walk myself, and I do not intend to, though I want to be honest that the temptation has grown, not diminished, the longer I've spent researching it. The specific seductive logic of believing that understanding something completely might somehow inoculate you against it. The same logic that cost Tobias his life at a console running a signal on continuous loop. The same logic that sent me down this entire research path in the first place, well past the point any reasonable person would have called the story finished. I think, most nights now, about the specific asymmetry I found buried in that folklore archive. The idea that whatever answers the walk has been rehearsing considerably longer than any individual walker has been alive to notice it happening. I think about my brother's careful climbing tally, and Edmund Farrow's identical tally in an entirely different account from an entirely different coastline, and I wonder, more than I'm comfortable admitting, whether these are actually separate phenomena at all, or simply different doors into the same patient waiting room, each with its own local rules and rituals layered over something considerably older and considerably less concerned with the specific shape any individual door happens to take. If you ever come across the Half-Light game in a forwarded clip, a forum post, a challenge some corner of the internet is quietly circulating under a dozen different names, I am asking you on behalf of Marisol and Benny and Priscilla and Griffin and my own brother, who still keeps his careful frightened log every single evening at exactly the same 20 minutes. Do not walk the hallway. Do not watch anyone else's footage closely enough to learn its rhythm. And if twilight ever falls in a house where every light happens to be off, and you feel for even a moment the specific curious pull to see what's standing at the other end of it, turn the lights back on and stay exactly where you are.